Welcome, curious soul, to Tales of the Tattered Book. I am your host, the keeper of the book. With each passing moment, new horrors appear on these weathered pages, yearning to be told. As I open this arcane tome, remember, knowledge comes at a price, and some truths are better left unspoken. Tonight, we delve into the depths of guilt and eternal punishment. In Deathloop, we follow one man's journey through a hell of his own making, where death is not an escape, but merely the beginning of torment. Steel yourself, dear listener, for in this tale, forgiveness is a luxury not all can afford.
The cramped space, barely 6 by 8 feet, felt more suffocating than ever that day. The concrete walls were covered in scratches from previous inhabitants, adding to the claustrophobic atmosphere. The flickering light bulb on the ceiling cast a sickly glow over a cold metal tray. John stared at his last meal, a cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate milkshake, with a mixture of revulsion and resignation. As he sat there, John's mind wandered to the events that led him to this moment. He had once been a respected member of his community, a loving husband and father, until that night. The memories flooded back, vivid and horrifying. The argument, the rage, the knife in his hand, and then her eyes. Her eyes filled with disbelief as the blade plunged into her chest, again and again. But it didn't end there. It was as if something had taken control of him, guiding his hand through the house with a dark purpose. What followed was just more eyes, more screams, and more death. The vision of the warm blood of his family on his hands made his stomach churn. He had washed those hands 1,000 times since, but they never felt clean. John shook his head, trying to dispel the haunting memories. Just then, a soft knock preceded the entrance of Father Michael, his weathered face a mask of practiced compassion.
Are you ready for confession, my son?
John nodded numbly, his voice a rasp. As ready as I'll ever be, Father. Father Michael pulled out a small, leather-bound Bible and began to speak softly. Yet the words felt hollow, echoing around the cramped cell with no escape. Father, I don't know if I'm ready for this. How can I possibly atone for what I've done?
The path to redemption is never easy. But remember, death is not the end. It's merely a transition.
The walk to the death chamber felt eternal. John's legs trembled and threatened to give out on him, but the guards held onto his arms tightly, half supporting and half dragging him forward. He could hardly catch his breath as he struggled to keep up. Every step seemed to stretch on forever until finally they reached the end of the long hallway. The final door stood before them, signaling the beginning of his inevitable demise. As the door creaked open, John was met with the chilling sight of the execution chamber, cold, sterile, and dominated by the looming presence of the lethal injection table. Looking through the window, he caught sight of the witnesses. His parents sat in the front row, his mother's face buried in her hands, his father staring straight ahead with the rigid posture of a man desperately trying to maintain composure. His sister, who had always believed in him, couldn't meet his eyes, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And then he saw him, his father-in-law, the man who had once welcomed him into his family with open arms. Now those same arms were crossed tightly across his chest, his hollow-eyed gaze boring into John with a mixture of grief and grim satisfaction. John's throat tightened as the guards roughly strapped him onto the table, the cool plastic of the restraints digging into his wrists and ankles. The next few moments were a blur. Father Michael began to murmur prayer.
God, have mercy of this poor soul. And Jesus said unto him,
his words a mix
Verily
of
I say
salvation
unto
and
thee,
judgment.
Today thou shalt be with me in paradise.
The warden recited his sentence for everyone to hear.
Prisoner, John Edward Miller, has been sentenced to death by lethal injection for the
But
charges
to John,
of first-degree
their words
murder.
held no meaning. Finally, the medical staff entered the room. They wore sterile white garments and carried an assortment of needles and tubes. Grim-faced, half covered by surgical masks, they started their work. Then there was a prick in his arm as the needle slipped into his vein. He felt an icy cold creep up from his hand, threatening to seize his heart. Another masked official stood by a control panel, his gloved hands poised over a series of switches.
Any last words, Miller?
The warden asked, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. John looked around at everyone present, their faces blurred through his teary eyes. He wanted to apologize, to beg forgiveness. But what use was it? His sins were unforgivable, beyond redemption. John simply squeezed his eyes shut and waited. The first switch was flicked. Instead of the expected pain, a cold numbness spread from the point of injection, creeping up his arm and spreading across his chest. His heart raced frantically at first, then began to slow, each beat growing heavier and more labored than the last. The second switch went down. His mind fogged up as the drug reached his brain. His thoughts became sluggish, his senses dulled, and black spots clouded his vision. Time seemed to slow down, with each tick of the clock echoing around the room like a deafening drumbeat. Every second felt like an eternity. His mind was flooded with emotions, regret, fear, and fragmented memories that flashed across his consciousness. He remembered laughter from happier days, the warmth of love shared with others, and the pain of loss. When the third and final switch was flipped, a suffocating weight descended on his body. He gasped desperately for air until even that became impossible. As he exhaled one final time, his heart stuttered and stopped, and in that final moment, he knew it was all over. And then, impossibly, John's eyes snapped open. He was back in his cell, with the same cold metal tray of food in front of him. He felt like he was spinning, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The sensation of his life slipping away still lingered in his mind and in his body. It all seemed so impossible. He needed to ensure he was not dreaming or dead, so he pinched himself with enough force to break the skin. The sharp pain that shot through his body confirmed that this was all too real. It was then that the cell door swung open. John froze, expecting some shadowy figure of death to appear, but instead a familiar figure stepped in. Father Michael, his weathered face a mask of practiced compassion.
Are you ready for confession, my son?
John's second death was worse. Again, he was led down the same long hall, his legs feeling as if they were made of lead. The stares from the guards seemed colder now. Even their grip on his arms was more forceful. It was as if they were angry at him for having to go through the process twice. This time, he fought against it with everything he had. He tried with all his might to hold on to consciousness, to resist the icy grip that crept through every inch of his being. But his efforts were futile, and he once again succumbed to the void. When John woke up for the third time in his cell, he couldn't contain his fear any longer. In a fit of rage and desperation, he flung his meager meal tray against the wall, sending it crashing to the ground, sending bits of bread and a few measly scraps flying in all directions. He threw himself against the cold metal bars, screaming for someone, anyone, to come. Sweat poured down his face, soaking the collar of his uniform.
Are you ready for confession, my son?
Father Michael's voice echoed once again in the cell, as if he was there the all time. "What is happening to me?" he begged. "Why can't I die?" Father Michael didn't have a chance to respond before guards stormed into the cell, drawn by his screams. They forcefully removed John from the cell as he thrashed and yelled, heading towards the execution room. As the lethal injection was administered, John locked eyes with Father Michael, who remained stoic with a mysterious smile on his lips. Darkness. Then light. Father Michael found John curled into a tight ball, tears streaming down his face. He extended a hand to offer solace, but John pulled back in fear. "Father!" John choked out. "I don't want to die again."
But we all die, son. Sooner or later. And in your case, You need to die again and again.
Something in the priest's tone made John look up. As he met Father Michael's gaze, John was struck by how his eyes were no longer their usual brown color, but instead a deep, dark black, mere hollow sockets that pierced into his soul. The corners of the priest's mouth stretched into an unnaturally wide grin, revealing a mouthful of sharp teeth dripping with saliva. Without thinking, John recoiled in fear and lashed out with his fist, feeling it connect with the priest's unnaturally hard jaw. There was a sickening crack, followed by a thud as Father Michael crumpled to the ground like a marionette with its strings cut. Alarms blared and guards swarmed in, pinning John down and pulling him out of the cell. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of Father Michael standing up, blood pouring from his broken jaw. The priest's mouth appeared to widen, almost splitting his face in half as it continued to stretch open.
You can't escape judgment, John.
Father Michael's voice boomed, though his ruined mouth never moved.
There's no forgiveness for what you've done. No heaven. No hell. Only this.
John screamed as they pulled him down the corridor. Every cell he passed held another Father Michael, each more grotesque and horrifying than the last. The voices of the clones blended together into a deafening chorus of accusations that filled the air.
Murderer. Sinner. You thought death would free you? This is your eternity, John.
One Father Michael, his face a writhing mass of maggots, leaned close to the bars. As he spoke, fat white larvae spilled out of his mouth, nose, and ears, squirming on the ground as he spoke.
Did you think your life had meaning? That your death would bring closure? There is no meaning, no closure. Only the endless cycle of your guilt.
Another Father Michael, with eyes that wept black ichor, sneered in disgust. The thick, tar-like substance oozed down his cheeks, burning holes in the floor where it dripped.
Redemption? A fairy tale for children. There's no washing away your sins, John. They're etched into your soul for eternity.
A third Father Michael appeared to be made entirely of twisting, scorched nerve endings. Every movement sent visible waves of agony through his form, yet he smiled with ecstasy.
Pain is clarity, John, and you'll never see more clearly than you will here.
John knew that the execution chamber awaited ahead. Please, no more, no more. He thrashed wildly, his throat raw and harsh from all the screaming. I've already died, please, I've died so many times. I can't take it anymore. The door burst open, and John's scream died in his throat. The execution chamber he remembered had transformed into something out of his worst nightmare. The room pulsed with an unholy light, the walls themselves seeming to breathe. In the center, what had once been a static execution table now writhed and twisted, a mass of living tissue and metal. Straps of muscle and sinew reached out, wrapping around his wrists and ankles. Surrounding it were a dozen Father Michaels, each one a hybrid of flesh and furniture, melded together with various torture devices.
Welcome back, John,
they said in unison. Let me go! Let me go! He screamed, straining against the table's grip, but it was fruitless. For one terrible moment, everything stopped. The Father Michaels, the pulsing walls, even his own heartbeat seemed to pause. Then the table heaved again, pulling him closer, until he was forced to lie down, as if being offered up like a sacrifice. The straps enveloped him, snaking up his arms and legs, constricting him tighter and tighter. As the tissue pulsed and tightened around him, one Father Michael stepped forward from the grotesque chorus. Unlike his twisted brethren, this one appeared almost normal, save for his black eyes. And in his hand, John recognized with horror the same kitchen knife that had started it all. No, please. His breathing quickens, on the verge of hyperventilating. Everything but that. Tears streamed down his face as the memories flooded back. His pleas devolved into broken sobs, his body trembling uncontrollably against the table's grip. Like a child begging for mercy, his babbling became an incoherent stream of apologies and whimpers.
Shall we begin again?
Father Michael's voice cut through John's hysteria.
This time, you'll feel every cut you inflicted, every single one.
The knife plunged into his chest, in the exact spot where he had first stabbed his wife. Pain exploded through him, more intense than anything he'd ever felt. As he writhed in agony, the other Father Michaels descended with their implements of torture, each taking a turn inflicting more pain upon him, and as consciousness slipped away once more, one thought echoed in his mind. This time, please let it be the last.
And so, dear listeners, we close the pages on John's eternal torment, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions for all eternity. Remember, sometimes our own guilt can be the most terrifying monster of all. If you dare to delve deeper into these eldritch mysteries, subscribe to our podcast, leave a rating and review, and whisper of our tales to others. Your engagement feeds the book, fueling the terrors yet to come. Until next time, and may your nights be sleepless and your dreams unsettling.